Hey, ZombieTactics today, and I wanted to take a few moments to talk about world events, specifically the situation in Japan and the kind of hysteria and fear-mongering that's going on in some cases regarding the nuclear scare, so far as it would affect citizens of the United States or Western Europe, things like that. The folks in Japan are in serious straits right now, and you can't underplay, I think, too much what a terrible disaster this is for Japan. The combination of one of the largest earthquakes that most of us will hear about in our lifetimes, followed by a tsunami of incredible proportions, bad weather, outages of electricity and sewer and other services, hundreds of thousands of people affected, probably millions of people affected by the time this is done, thousands and thousands of people dead in the initial tsunami, and probably many more to be discovered afterwards. So I want to make sure that I don't give the impression that I'm downplaying the seriousness of this to folks who are in Japan and the Japanese people themselves. Our heart should go out to them, and they should be in our prayers. It concerns me, though, that when I watch the news, and you finally just have to turn it off and not look at the web, that the quality of reporting is horrible in this regard, having to do with the potential effects on citizens of the United States, especially, say, in California or in Hawaii. And every time you're turning around, they are reporting what's happening at one of these nuclear facilities using language that is designed to be the most sensationalist and scary that you can possibly imagine. And there isn't any sense of proportion to that reporting, and I'll talk a little bit about what they're doing here in a second. But before going too far, and I hesitate to do this because it sounds like name dropping, and it makes it sound like I'm trying to pretend that I'm some big deal, and I'm not. I have friends and family who are among the very people who would be called upon right now to mobilize American efforts to prevent a disaster or even a significant health scare if anything like a radiation poisoning scenario were even remotely possible in the United States of America as a result of what's going on in Japan. I say that with a straight face because it's absolutely true. There are folks in my family who have, in one way or another, supervised over the closing of nuclear facilities and have had to deal with the actual planning for nuclear disasters for the government on a very, very serious level, going over every kind of possible scenario that you could imagine, including the kind of thing that's going on in Japan right now. They're not worried. And I'm not worried either, because I know the same things they know, and they're the kinds of things that aren't secret. They're just not reported well in the media. I have heard the following phrase more times than I care to in the media, or read it. Nuclear explosion. And I just want to scream, because there hasn't been anything close to a nuclear explosion at any of these reactors. A nuclear explosion would be an atomic explosion, an atomic bomb, either a nuclear fission reaction or something like a hydrogen fusion reaction, the kind with the big mushroom cloud that goes up into the sky for tens of thousands of feet, miles as a matter of fact. That ain't happened, folks. It hasn't happened. But yet I've heard the news report it as though that is what's happened. They say nuclear explosion at such and such a Fukuyama whatever facility. And it hasn't been a nuclear explosion. It's been something like an explosion that's a chemical explosion or a chemical fire. A simple hydrogen, heat to hydrogen causes a flaming explosion kind of thing. And while that makes for exciting video, it's not a nuclear explosion. I've heard people talking about all kinds of meltdown scenarios that are technical impossibilities in some cases due to the design of these reactors. This isn't Chernobyl. This is a much more modern design of nuclear reactor than anything the Soviets had at Chernobyl, for instance. And these are more modern designs than what we had at 3 Mile Island, where not a single person died in that incident, or even got a disease as a result of that incident. Not anything that you can prove for that matter, although I know some people who are conspiracy theorists like to pretend otherwise. Let's go over some of the particulars. What's likely going to happen, kind of the worst case scenario in some ways in Japan, at any of the facilities that are having a problem, is that the groundwater level would be affected if the cores were to actually melt down and melt through the containment vessels, which is an almost functional impossibility due to the design of the reactors. Melt through the bottom of the containment vessels into the earth to the point where it hits groundwater, and then a giant steam plume, similar to what a geyser would look like, would shoot up into the sky a couple hundred, maybe 1,000 feet. It would look really dramatic. If that happens at any of these nuclear facilities, that's just bad news for everybody in Japan, because it means that the area is going to be inhabitable for probably about 20 to 50 miles around any facility where that happened. And again, this is an extreme unlikelihood owing to the design of those reactors. But in that case, and that is one of the worst possible cases that could happen at these reactors, that steam shooting up into the air does not throw radioactive particulates up high enough into the atmosphere in sufficient quantity that any of them could be blown over by trade winds or the jet stream or anything like that to the United States or even Hawaii. You'd be able to detect a slight increase in background radiation, and that's about it. You would get no more radiation exposure in total from an event like that, or even multiple events like that in Japan, than if you went on a flight on an airline a couple times a year. Period. End of story. Yet you're hearing nuclear explosions. You're hearing people, there's a run on iodine tablets, potassium iodide, and people are being gouged for prices on that, and there's fear. And there are even YouTubers who are putting on face masks and hair nets and what looks like anti-nuclear gear or something like that, and going crazy, warning you all that it's the end of the world. That's nuts. And I'm putting myself out here when I make a video like this. I'm telling you, I know what I'm talking about. And I know people who know much more about it than I will ever know. And they're not frightened. And they're not frightened because they know better. Worst case scenario, you're not going to be affected in the United States. The money you've spent on iodide tablets, I won't say it's wasted. Put it away in case there's ever actually a nuclear disaster somewhere where you live, not 7,000 miles away. But it ain't going to happen here. There ain't going to be a problem. You can relax, you can calm down, and maybe you can put your efforts towards something more useful, like giving money to the Red Cross or some other organization that will help the folks in Japan. But part of the reason why this bugs me so much is that, aside from the sensationalism, is that people are in some cases doing things which will present a much higher risk to their health than any nuclear fallout scenario coming from Japan to the California or Hawaii coast. They're running out and they're buying potassium iodide tablets, and they're taking them in quantities that are poisonous. You're only supposed to get, and I forget what exactly the dose is per day. It's something like either 130 micrograms or something like that. I'll try and find an article and post it here. That figure's probably widely off a day. And when you start taking much more than that, you are going to cause yourself some serious health difficulties, much greater health difficulties than if you had a low level, the very low background level radiation that is coming from this situation. So people are being whipped up into a state of fear over a non-problem to do things that are going to hurt them worse than anything that the situation we're talking about could ever hurt them. Worse than that, I've heard stories of people saying, well, there's potassium iodide in salt, and sure enough, you take a look at your Morton salt, and here's some bulk salt that I've got, and you look in there, this is iodized salt, and if you look in there, I'll throw a picture up, there's potassium iodide in this salt. So people are actually saying, well, just eat a bunch of that salt. Eat a bunch of that salt because it's got potassium iodine in it. It'll protect you from the radioactive cloud that's coming from Japan, and we're all doomed. The problem is there's so little salt, potassium iodide in this salt, that there's no way you could eat enough salt to give you a useful dose of potassium iodide without practically killing yourself from that amount of salt. But yet people are out there going, oh, buy salt, it's got potassium iodide in it. You're noticing a pattern here? People are brought to the point of panic where they start doing things that are more dangerous to their health than the very thing that they're panicking about in the first place. Calm down and stand down if you're in the United States of America, because there's no nuclear disaster coming your way from Japan. And shame on you, those of you who have no shame and are whipping this scenario up into a frenzy for no better reason than, in the case of the major media, more advertising revenue, and for those of you on YouTube, more advertising revenue and more viewer counts. That's Zombie Tactics for today, and we'll see you next time with something a little bit more positive. Take care. Bye-bye.